there were no regulations, and then the state did not intervene to safeguard the deposit. There was no such thing as a deposit insurance.
The only lesson history teaches us is that we never really learn from it. So that is a funny thing, but there's some truth in it.
These regulations are going to hurt some certain racial groups because this bank is actually serving these people, right? There must have been some direct conversation between the government or the state and the local people or leaders, right? And that's how they ended up having some less strict, but still like some kind of regulations on how directors can get loans from these banks.
During the war, the ethnic Chinese entrepreneurs in Hong Kong, most of them were Cantonese, and they dispersed their family members to mainland China and also Southeast Asia, including Singapore and Malaysia, where they had some personal connections.
I couldn't find enough sources or direct sources really connecting the bankers I covered back to Hong Kong in terms of family or business ties.
The Global South Network provides an important space to share experiences and learn good practices from one another.
Dialogue takes on a particular importance thanks to Global South Network, which allow us to believe in a better world of the rule of law.
It's a wonderful initiative.
The Global South Network opened new horizons for judicial cooperations.
Global South Network provide a platform for meaningful dialogue and cooperation, fostering efforts to build a more equitable and resilient legal landscape.
GSN Network continues to expand areas of activity, further strengthening its impact and reach.
The universal concept of justice compels us to join our efforts, and this is the forum for promoting the same goal.
Well deserved for the hectic activity you have made. I am astonished, I am amazed, I was impressed.
May I at the outset commend you, Dr. Ayad, for the immense work that you're doing in the GSN, and the Global South Network is a much admired initiative.
It's commendable. South Network focuses on all disciplines and regions, creating a bridge between academia, civil society, legal community, etc.
It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the third seminar in Phase 5 of the International Interdisciplinary PhD in Progress weekly seminar series organized by the Global South Network. I'm Dr. Noman Riayat, founder and chief convener of the Global South Network and a lecturer in law at Leicester Law School, University of Leicester. My research interests lie in judicial politics, the rule of law, judicial independence, and constitutionalism. I have had the honor and privilege of convening this weekly seminar series since the establishment of the network in March 2023. It's a pleasure to chair today's Global South Network PhD in Progress session, and I look forward to learning about the presenters' research and engaging in the discussion that follows. I'm joined by two discussants and one peer commentator. Dr. Seung Lee is the first discussant for today's session. Dr. Lee is an associate professor of finance at Saïd Business School, University of Oxford. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of California at Berkeley, where he was a Regents Fellow. Before then, he studied at Seoul National University in Korea, obtaining his BS in physics and MA in economics. Dr. Lee's primary research area is in monetary economics and macrofinance. He takes questions about conventional and unconventional monetary policies and their stabilizations in era of higher uncertainties and frictions. Dr. Xin Elizabeth Wang is the second discussant for today's session. Dr. Wang is a lecturer in international commercial law and has a PhD in commercial and financial law from the Leicester Law School, University of Leicester. Ho Wong is the peer commentator for today's session. Wang is a PhD candidate in East Asian Studies at the University of Edinburgh. His current research explores the networks of capital and power elites in the wartime Japanese Empire and the use of private capital to fuel imperial ambitions. Finally, it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today's seminar, Jeremy Gu, who is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Warwick. Jeremy Gu's PhD focus on business and financial history, Chinese overseas capitalism, transnationalism, and more generally Southeast Asia's past and present. His project explores the development of financial capitalism in British Malaya and China during the early 20th century. His interdisciplinary work has been published in peer-reviewed journals such as the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, Asia Pacific Business Review, Global Policy, Transactions of the Royal Historical Society. Today, Jeremy will present part of the PhD project titled Banking Failure and Regulatory Reform on the Periphery, the Kwong Yik Bank in Southeast Asia from 1903 till 1913. They will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, followed by 5 to 10 minutes of comments from our discussant and peer commentators. If time permits, we will then open the floor for a 15-minute question and answer session with the audience. Jeremy, we are delighted to have you with us today. The screen is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. And again, my thanks to Dr. Riyad, the convener of the Global South Network at Leicester, and many thanks for inviting me to give a work in progress paper that's coming out of my current project. So my name is Jeremy, and I am currently a third-year PhD student based in the University of Warwick, Department of History. So I can already feel the stress coming into my daily life as I get on with my writing, right? Because we have to get our dissertation done, ideally within 3.5 years, but in most cases between 4 to 5 years, I guess. So today I'm going to present a paper that is going to be a case study in my upcoming thesis. Right. So this is just to give some geographical context and a background to the region which I primarily focus on. So I focus on what was called British Malaya. So currently Malaysia and Singapore, right? So former British colonies. But during the early 20th century, both Singapore and Malaya, right, they were governed under different British jurisdictions, some states falling under direct British rule, whereas some under varying forms of informal governance. So for today's presentation, I am focusing more on what was called the British trade settlements, comprising the port cities of Singapore, Malacca, as well as Penang. So they were known as a British Crown colony. They have a governor who reported directly to the colonial office in London. So I do realize that the term trade settlements might be a bit strange and a bit unfamiliar. So that was why I included a image here, right, of a very famous Chinese actress, Fan Bingbing, right, who acted as a travel ambassador for the city of Malacca, and I think she is still the ambassador now. So I try to tell people in this part of the world. So if you can't remember Singapore or you can't remember the Straits Settlements, just keep this image in mind, and perhaps if you remember something, you can remember the Straits Settlements in a way. Right. So I'm also pleased to share that my paper has recently been published in the Journal of Business History sometime last year. I believe it was in June 2025. So here's a QR code which you could scan using your phone, and you can access the article instantly. I believe it's still open access. So for this presentation, it's not just copy and paste from the article, right? So I would argue that it is still a work in progress, because I'm still developing parts of this paper further, right? Not only in terms of the empirical detail, but more importantly, how these cases in Southeast Asia engages with the ongoing conversations in the capitalism literature, for instance. So the literature between banking as well as regulation, that's something that I'm really interested in past and present. So just very quickly on the main themes of today's presentation. So bank failure and the imposition of new regulations. So there's really immense interest on banking as well as tighter rules, right, since the Great Recession in 2008, when there's more attention placed on the financial system itself, right? And since then, there has been a lot of publications, a lot of books, a lot of journal articles across different disciplines being published on financial system, on economy in a broad perspective. So most of them are critiques, right? Critiques on capitalism, critiques on neoliberalism. Why, in terms of their prioritization of economic value of profits, which was kind of made at the expense of our morality. So here you see a book here published by the very famous philosopher Michael Sandel, right? What money can't buy. So I think in this book he discussed how essential products, right, like utilities, even things like queuing up, how they became capitalized, and really sometimes it gets in the way of our morality. So in this broad literature, they often emphasize how the government is important, right? So the state acting as a form of gatekeeper in ensuring financial stability. So the government has to step in, right, to rein in these financial firms for the greater social good. So that's one of the main narratives. So in along this line, the state would impose like tighter regulations to protect ordinary depositors, right? Ordinary citizens, to protect them from the harm of the financial failure. So here I am referring to a famous research and publications done by, I think, Catherine Schrenk from the University of Oxford in financial history. So besides this importance of protecting the ordinary people, there's also increasingly national security concerns, right? Particularly in the current geopolitical context, but it's not only now, because it's not new, because this has happened before. So for example, in Germany in the 1930s, where laws were tightened, right, to protect the national interests in a time of war, and more recently in Malaysia during the late 1990s, particularly in 1998 during the Asian financial crisis, right, when the government imposed foreign exchange controls, right, prohibiting foreign exchange from leaving the country at a time of crisis. So to connect back to my project, my main question is this. I would like to find out whether these regulations, these financial regulations, were they shaped in a similar way when we take context outside the West into consideration. So here I'm talking about British Malaya, which I refer to as the Periphery, right, because it was on the margins of the British Empire during the late 19th and early 20th century. So the main argument that I'm putting forward is that the connection between the states and the regulations, this relationship is kind of more complicated and more nuanced, right? When we take into account not only a colonial environment, but also in an environment that is more multicultural, because we don't really see a multicultural economy or society in a Western context when in comparison to diverse settings such as Southeast Asia. So I argue that in the British trade settlements, the banking regulations were shaped not only because of the need for financial stability, which is really crucial in its own right, but also important cultural and racial considerations which took place in the background, right, that is less visible. So I think it's the imperatives of financial stability combined with ongoing cultural and racial considerations that shaped the engagement between state and society, and it was these engagements that produced the regulations. So to prove this, I look at the case study of the Kwong Yik Bank, right? So the KYB. So this bank is really important in history because it was the first modern bank, the first modern banks to be formed by the ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia. So the year when it was founded, the year was 1903. So it's a bit contradictory, but despite the importance and the significance of the Kwong Yik Bank, it isn't really studied very much in the current future, whether we're looking at global history, you're looking at economic history, or even Southeast Asian history. And this has a lot to do with the availability of sources, because unfortunately there isn't any available data or business documents, banking reports of the Kwong Yik Bank, as they were very likely destroyed during the Second World War in Southeast Asia, what we call the Japanese occupation. So what was left are very segregated documents in various archives, and not really state documents, but more of newspaper records, and also the individual minutes, individual documents of bankers that were involved in the Kwong Yik Bank. So here is a list of the founding bank directors of the Kwong Yik Bank in 1903. So as you can see from this list, most of, if not all of the bankers, they came from very similar ethnic backgrounds, right? So they were mostly first generation migrants from the province of Guangdong, that is in the southeast coast of China. So they were Cantonese who moved to British Malaya. And they also had very similar economic interests, in the sense of they were involved in a similar industry. So most of them were involved in general trade. They ran what we call sundry shops, like provision shops, and a good number of them were operated pawn shops, right? They were pawnbrokers. So I would like to point your attention to one of the main founders of the bank, right? So his name is Wang. So you can see his image on the left of the screen. So he is really clad in the Chinese attire. Right? So what's amazing about him is his really close connections to local society in Malaya, right? Or more precisely in the state of Johor. So what was unique about him was that he had a really close relationship with the Sultan of Johor back then in the late 19th century. So he started off in the construction industry, and he built many important buildings in the state of Johor, including the Sultan's palace. So this important relationship continued to this day, right? Because there was a recent news report of the current Sultan of Johor, who is the current king of Malaysia. He actually appointed one of Wang's descendants as a representative of the Chinese community. So we see this the social embeddedness of the bankers back then, which continues to today. So what another unique point about Kwong Yik Bank is in terms of its structure. So it is curious that the Kwong Yik Bank had different names in both English and Chinese, and this is commonly overlooked in the literature. So in English, it is called the Kwong Yik Banking Company Limited, whereas in Mandarin it means something else. So the bank called itself the Kwong Yik Savings Native Bank Company. So we see different concepts here, and I mean it is a proof of how the bank was a product of different influences, right? So we see the British, the Western influence here in terms of the limited liability system, whereas on the other hand, we see the influence from China, or more precisely from Guangdong, right? The what we call the traditional financial institutions in China, the Yinghao or the silver shop. So these, I mean, both concepts they mean different things, but in the case of Kwong Yik Bank, the bankers managed to put them together. So it is very unfortunate that there are no further archival sources showing the actual operations of the bank, right, in terms of annual reports, in terms of performance, or else I think we could really go deeper into the dynamics of this unique structuring of the bank. The bank was also special because it was the very first bank in British Malaysia which reached out to the public. So during that context, the biggest banks, so they were, I'm referring to the British multinational banks, so banks like HSBC, banks like chartered banks, so they mainly financed trade. They were serving Western enterprise and really big Chinese businesses engaging in this transnational trade, and they rarely engaged the public. So the Kwong Yik Bank was a forerunner in this. So they allowed the common folks to start a savings account with as low as $5 straight. So this, I mean, is approximately 1 to 2 months of wages for the average laborer. And very interestingly, in spite of itself being a bank, the Kwong Yik Bank also provided pawning services. So think a service that we do not usually associate with a bank today, but the Kwong Yik Bank provided that service to the commoners and the ordinary people back then. So I suppose this has got to do with the background of the directors, because a lot of them actually engaged in pawning. So we see some continuity here, and also the imperative in engaging the masses. So now I'm moving very quickly to its failure in 1913. So the Kwong Yik Bank only survived for a decade, founded in 1903 and collapsed in 1913, around the period before the First World War, which started in 1914. So this failure took place amidst some economic disruption due to falling commodity prices, so rubber and tin commodities that were essential to the trade of and economy of British Malaya. So upon the failure of the Kwong Yik Bank, there were massive impact because not only businesses, right, but ordinary people also lost their savings. So there was some societal unrest, and because of this instability, the colonial government, right, referring to the government of the Straits Settlements, they straight away they started to initiate lawsuits against the directors, and they also tried to implement drastic and immediate measures or new regulations on banking, which I would discuss shortly after. So these lawsuits were initiated after discrepancies were found in the bank, right? So there were some issues, some concerns with the lack of accountability in the operation of the Kwong Yik Bank, right? So there were certain findings in the court proceedings. So we see findings such as the overdrafts, right, sometimes being made, sometimes not being made. So there were some issues with record management and even the falsification of records, right? So the non-existence of certain deposits. And to put it further, the failure of the Kwong Yik Bank was rightly reported in the press back then as being a failure of the Chinese bank. But what's really special was that the practices committed by the directors, they were ascribed as being practices done by the Chinese community. So certain common corporate practices such as the interlocking directorships, they were being ascribed with ethnic characteristics. They were being understood as something that was uniquely Chinese, even though in reality it wasn't. So to move further into the company law reform, which took place in December 1913. So this was really instrumental, considering that there were actually no specific regulations on banking or even on finance in the British trade settlements at that time. There were only regulations on businesses, on limited liability corporations, which explains why the Kwong Yik Bank registered itself as a banking company limited. So what was the gist of these enhanced regulations were that they imposed more prohibitions on banking directors, on senior staff, on obtaining loans, right? So a complete ban here. And besides that, there were also some regulations requiring these Chinese banks to use English, right? Not only the language, but also the methods of accounting and record keeping in their daily operations. And of course, also requesting a bit more transparency, asking them to publish their audited accounts in a English newspaper at a regular basis. So very ironically, even though these regulations were sparked by a failure of a Chinese bank, but it incurred really strong opposition from the British and Western business community. So here we're referring to the European merchants. So the British merchant, the chairman of the local chamber of commerce, C.W. Derbyshire, he criticized these regulations as grandmotherly and ill-considered, right? Because these regulations did not pertain to the Chinese. They were actually applying to the entire business and banking community. And a similar response was made by the Singapore Chinese Chamber of Commerce. It's too strict. And we also have a more nuanced view from Mr. Tan Jiak Kim. So he plays a very important role here, right? He is a very famous local merchant, and he was also an appointed official of the legislature. So what he said is essentially that these regulations were of no use in reality, because what the bank directors would do is that they would just find someone, right? Their agents, appoint them as directors, whereas the real bank directors would control the bank from the back. Right, so this is an image of Tan Jiak Kim. So you can see him on the right here. So for him, unlike most other Chinese, he is pretty unique because he is what we call him a Straits-born Chinese, right? He's born in Singapore. So I mean, many generations before him, right? His and forefather came to British Malaya from China, and he's kind of a descendant of a already locally settled Chinese family. So it's kind of Straits Chinese. So it was him that played the decisive role in terms of accommodating the conflicting view between the colonial government as well as the Western merchants. So what he said was of course, supporting the colonial state in protecting the need to protect the ordinary people, the depositors, against the very big influence controlled by what he called Eastern people. So it's very important here that he did not use the word Chinese, rather he used the word Eastern, right? So trying to make the issue less Chinese but still Asian. So what he did was, in fact, propose new measures that were less drastic. So, for example, allowing loans to be made to banking staff, banking directors, as long as they do the proper accounting and they provide the needed collateral. And he also pushed, for greater transparency, greater intervention from the colonial state, and also monitoring, right? So the state also has to do its job in terms of monitoring and to act decisively if anything goes wrong early on. Right, just to reflect very quickly. So I think in this presentation, I talked a bit about the Kwong Yik Bank. So it is very important as the very first ethnic Chinese, or rather ethnic Cantonese modern bank formed in Southeast Asia and headquartered in Singapore, the capital of the Straits Settlements. So the Kwong Yik Bank is not only important as the first modern bank to be formed, but it is also crucial as the bank which caused the very first set of financial regulations to be imposed on the British Straits Settlements, so Singapore, Malacca, and Penang. So based on the case of Kwong Yik Bank, I believe there's a bit more to the state narrative that I mentioned at the very start of this presentation. So I feel that if we take very concrete and detailed examples from the global south, right, from the margins of empire, I believe that we could perhaps say a bit more about the relations between the failure of banks, failure of finance, and new regulations, because over here we obviously see the unique geographical context, the unique multiculturalism that's coming into play. So it's a bit more nuanced in that sense. So thank you very much, and I believe this is the end of our presentation, and I look forward to any comments and suggestions.
Thank you, Jeremy, for such a fantastic presentation on banking failure and regulatory reform. So now I invite Dr. Seung Lee to share his comments and give feedback on Jeremy's presentation. Over to you, Dr. Lee.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me as a discussant. This is great paper, slightly, I'm from economics background and I do not know much about like business history, but if you think about the big picture question, like he's asking, like in this paper, basically the state or the government tries to intervene and tries to impose a lot of regulations on the banking sector, because banking sector itself, sometimes they create like market failure. They do something that is beneficial to their directors, but overall it imposes some like negative externalities on the market, and then those private agents in the market cannot correct this externality. So from state perspective or British Empire's perspective, government officials in London, they try to they observe what's happening in SS Straits Settlement, and then they see, okay, so this is the time to regulate these banks. That's how I kind of understand what has happened like at that time. And then if you think about this bank, BYK, they basically say, oh, these regulations are gonna hurt some certain racial groups, because this bank is actually serving these people, right, primarily. So and then there must have been some direct conversation between the government or the state and the local people or leaders, right? And then and then that's how they ended up having some less strict but still like some kind of regulations on how directors can get loans from these banks. I think this is very interesting anecdote about how public policies should be formed. For example, like, you know, even if we tend to assume the government actually has a lot of information about optimal way to, regulate the market or the banking sector, still, in the real world, it's quite hard for them to know everything, know all the information like available, right? So sometimes they ask like private agents about, okay, so what should they do to, protect the people and protect the market, and preemptively like prevent the banking sector from, melting down, right? And in this case, this leader, I forgot the name, proposed that, okay, if this bank is, hit by these very, very strict regulations, it's going to hurt some, mostly ethnically Chinese people, because they were heavily reliant upon this bank, right? And then I'm quite pleased and surprised that actually they listened to this comment and then they kind of accommodated this concern in designing this public policy, right? So I think this is classic information problem, from more big picture kind of point of view. So government actually wanted to hear like what people thought about, the broad picture of protecting the financial stability, and and then they accounted for pros and cons. So all public policies should think about like trade-offs, right? Like whenever you impose some regulations, you can actually reduce the risk of financial instability, but also you can impact some certain group, in terms of how they can secure their loans and how they finance themselves, right? To banking sectors. And government actually thought that, okay, so this the second consideration of this ethnic Chinese group is big enough to rethink about the previous kind of commitment of regulations, right? So I think this paper can broadly speak to this large literature on how public policy should be formed and how government can basically extract information, elicit information from the society about the optimal approach to design their regulations on the banking sector. If you look at the current United States, Federal Reserve imposes a lot of regulations on the banking sector, but if you look at their actually governing structure, for example, regional Fed, like Federal Reserve Bank of New York actually has Class A directors who are actual bankers in the financial sector, so that they can actually say, okay, if you do regulation A, it's going to hurt the banking sector because we are going to reduce our loans to low-income people, and then it's going to hurt them like the first. So there is always constant interaction between the state or the government or the federal or the central bank and the society or the private sector. Then I think this example speaks to kind of that directions as well. Yeah. But overall, I really enjoyed your presentation. It's very interesting, and hopefully you can try it out on your dissertation and finish up your PhD. Good luck.
Right.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for very useful feedback. I'm sure Jeremy is going to benefit from that. Now allow me to invite Dr. Xin Elizabeth Wang from University of East Anglia to share her comments and give feedback on Jeremy's paper. Xin, over to you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you for presenting such an excellent talk, and thank you, Norman, for inviting me. So, and generally speaking, so I think this is a really good case study on the causes of bank corporate governance failures, regulatory gaps, and subsequent reforms. So, and looking at it from a historical perspective really makes the analysis more meaningful. Since my research background is in law, so I just inevitably tend to focus on some legal aspects. Although This is a case from over 100 years ago, and it still offers valuable lessons for modern banking law. And actually, listening to this presentation, it's reminded me of a saying, which is, the only lesson history teaches us is that we never really learn from it. So that is a funny saying, but there's some truth in it. So actually, the issues in this bank, in Kwong Yik Bank, regarding corporate governance and director duties remain relevant for many modern banks. For example, the Bahrain Bank's failure, which has happened in 1995, which is for the similar reasons. And your presentation mentioned that the collapse of Kwong Yik Bank exposed significant gaps in the colonial financial regulatory framework, that there were inadequacies of law, and at that time, the law for ordinary companies were not suitable for banks. So I think this is a significant finding in the legal field, and this finding also applies now, especially to banks that collapsed during the 2008 global financial crisis. And during the global financial crisis, people realized that the law of insolvency procedures for ordinary companies were not suitable for banks. So that's why many jurisdictions, many countries revised their bank insolvency laws. So this seems to confirm the point that the regulation of financial institutions is often postponed. So like serious problems arise first, and then people think about measures. And of course, it can't be denied that many reforms have been made, for example, ranging from lenient regulatory strategies to prudential regulation in the financial market. So at this point, we still learn some lessons from history. And another point I found this presentation really interesting was you mentioned that after this bank's failure, regulatory changes were determined through discussion and compromise among the different stakeholders, including banks, government, businesses, and even the chambers of commerce. And there are many discussions. And this also took into account Chinese management culture. So this, in fact, align with the principles of law, especially in the field of cross-border legal framework. For example, the principles of cross-border insolvency, which focus on authorizing and encouraging cooperation and coordination between jurisdictions, rather than attempting the unification of substantive law. So while respecting differences among national laws. So I think that is for me, that is very interesting findings for me. And at the end, so I have a question regarding some details of this bank failure, the Kwong Yik Bank failure. So my question is, when the bank encountered problems, so was there a bank run? So at that time, there was no deposit insurance schemes, as far as I know, right? So how was depositor protection handled? Were there any government intervention? So that is my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Rin, for sharing your thoughts. So we have got the legal perspective now. Now, allow me to invite Tsz Ho Wong to share his comments. Wong, over to you.
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, Jeremy, for your fascinating presentation. I also had the chance to read your great paper on business history. And I think you're finding that banking regulations in the settlement were the result of negotiations between local business communities and the British colonial authorities is an important contribution to the study of banking and business history in modern Asia. Because I'm working on the financial history of Japan and its economy during the Second World War, and I actually found some parallels between your paper and your presentation and my own research. For example, after the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in July 1937, the businessmen in Japan's home island and its colonies actually employed various tactics to respond to the increasing state intervention. For example, they moved their company to the newly occupied China, and also diversified their trading commodities, etc. And I just have one question, one small question, which about the relationships between the Chinese business communities in British Malaya and Hong Kong. Because one of my thesis chapters examined the financial history of Japanese occupied Hong Kong during the Pacific War. And I found that during the war, the ethnic Chinese entrepreneurs in Hong Kong, most of them were Cantonese, and they dispersed their family members to mainland China and also Southeast Asia, including Singapore and Malaya, where they had some personal connections. So I therefore wondering whether the directors of the Kwong Yik Bank, most of them were born in Guangdong, had any connections with the Hong Kong Chinese entrepreneurs. And that's all for my comments.
Thank you very much, Tsz Ho Wong, for sharing your thoughts, comments. Jeremy, you have now the economist perspective, legal perspective, and the area studies perspective. So I invite you to respond to these comments and answers if you have any. You don't need to answer all questions because it's an ongoing process. So entirely up to you. But take your time, feel no pressure, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Riyad. Yeah, what really feels like obtaining very precious reviewer feedback after you submit your journal article. Right, I would just perhaps thank you so much for all your very insightful comments in helping me to develop this piece further. So I have a very quick question for Seung, if I may. So I really appreciated your point in talking about the very important and often overlooked role of information, right? The information which the state might have and the information which local actors might have. So if I may ask, is the term that you are referring to, is the term called information asymmetry?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like, it's not the government who runs the economy, right? Or the banking sector. It's like private agent or local people, right? And then, like all this, especially at that time, I think, this is my conjecture. At that time, there was no like, very transparent like media that reports all this happenings in the banking sector. Especially among those high level kind of directors, right? So that's how we had all these corruptions going on, like between banks and their directors in terms of their loans and collateral and all these things, right? And then, so like from government perspective, they saw so there was obviously a problem going on about the loans and like the savings, and there was no deposit insurance at the time, so there it could lead to some types of bank runs, right? I mean, I don't know if actual bank runs happen, but they might have seen like preemptively that so without some regulations there might be a bank run which can hurt the economy of the settlement, right? So yeah, so without all this information or transparency, I would say, like the first response from the state would be, so let's do maximum regulations or restrictions on what they could do, and then now after and then after they announce these regulations, they can hear some backlash from these local people, right? And then they see, so if I do regulations, it can hurt the other segment of the society, right? Because they cannot secure their financing, right, from banks as before. So government actually back down a bit, and then they say, okay, so let me do a bit lesser kind of degree of restrictions or regulation on the banking sector. So I think when you think about option policies to financial stability, of course there's pros and cons of each policy, right? And then they didn't think through or the potential negative or cost of this policy, and then after they listen to local people hearing, saying, here is my concern about these regulations. So, and then government actually mitigate the strictness of their restrictions or regulations. So yes, to your question, I think this is classic problem of information asymmetry of the government. And now I think it's less concern, for the government of countries like Singapore, for example, they know almost everything about what's happening inside, large conglomerate or large banking sector, I think. But still, I think this is very interesting anecdotal studies that speak to that dimension, I think. So that's how I kind of view this whole picture of your work from economist perspective.
Right. Right, thanks, Seung. So I now move on to Elizabeth. Right, so thank you so much for your comments. I really appreciate your feedback that regulations are kind of postponed. I really like that word, and it's kind of how new rules are kind of reactive to something bad that happened. So in response to your question regarding a bank run, yeah, so that was. Unfortunately, I did not elaborate during my presentation, but indeed, kind of a bigger bank run happens in Singapore upon the failure of the Kwong Yik Bank. So, I mean, most of the bank's capital was withdrawn. So there were really long queues outside the bank, and the police had to be called in. So what was fascinating about the bank run was that not only were ordinary laborers involved, but the news reports were actually saying that there were a lot of women weeping, the involvement of women. So from this we can surmise that women also they were also customers of the bank. So there's some gender perspective here, and I think you are also absolutely right to point out that there were no regulations, and then the state did not intervene to safeguard the deposit. There was no such thing as a deposit insurance, and there wasn't even a lender of last resort back then, because it was such an early period, and so the bank had to really fend for itself. And when really things start going bad really quickly, and it just folded. So there was a big issue in Singapore and the trade settlements was that. So we understand this bank as an ethnic Chinese bank or ethnic Cantonese bank, right? But from the perspective, at least from the English public or from the British state, it's a bit problematic, because the bank can also be understood as a British company, because it was registered under and incorporated under British colonial law. So I guess that was partly why they were really concerned. So there's this regulatory perspective.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for providing this information. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so moving last but not least, Brian, right? So you really posed a very important question. So that exact same question was posed to me when I received the reviewer report that came with the article 1 or 2 years back, when the result was revised and resubmit. Yeah, so they asked whether were the bankers connected to Hong Kong, right? So unfortunately, I have to answer you directly that I couldn't find enough sources or direct sources really connecting the bankers I covered back to Hong Kong in terms of family or business ties. But what I would add is the potential implication of this bank to the banking history of China, right? So Chinese banking history, which usually frames modernization as a very clear shifts from like indigenous, from traditional banks, right? So Inhao, Tianzhang, and then moving on to modern banks during the Republican period. So this is the conventional view in the historiography. So I believe that there is some potential of the Kwong Yik Bank in disrupting this conventional view. Even though this got shut down by the reviewers because of the having inadequate archival sources. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jeremy, for responding to the questions and comments. Now I open the floor for question and answers. If anyone from the attendees has any questions or comments, please feel free to raise your hands, or you can also type in the chat box. Right, also I can't see any raised hands. Is there any follow-up questions from the discussants or dear commentator? All right, in that case, we already are very close to the end of the session. So allow me to make concluding remarks. Jeremy, thank you very much for presenting such a very important and relevant topic. Even though it's a historical case study, but I can see many, clear relevance to ongoing developments in many global south countries. So in that sense, it's a very important talk. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee, Dr. Wang, Tsz Ho Wong, for their thoughtful and engaging feedback, and to everyone who joined us today for your participation and support. The Global South Network warmly welcomes PhD students from all disciplines and from every corner of the world to share their research and receive interdisciplinary feedback. If you are interested in presenting your work or taking part in a future session, please contact me at leicgsn@gmail.com, leicgsn@gmail.com. Same time next week, let's meet our next guest speaker, Farid Guloyev, PhD candidate at Maynooth University, Ireland, who is going to present their ongoing PhD project titled Exploring Full Autonomy Within World Trade Organization as a Distinct Concept in Public International Law on 28th of January from 3 to 4 p.m. UK time. Until then, look after yourself, take care, goodbye everyone, and thank you once again for being with us.
Thank you, Norman.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.